So I am Dr. Sam Richards from Penn State University and Konkuk University here in Seoul, where I am also a professor. And I have been teaching sociology for 40 years, both in the United States and in different places around the world. And I have been thinking about Korea, studying and thinking about Korea for 40 years. And in fact, I ate kimchi for the first time 40 years ago when I was first introduced to Korean culture. So it is my very first Korean food, and my favorite. In terms of being a kimchi global ambassador, I feel very honored because kimchi is such an important food for the nation of Korea, and it's recognizable around the world. Is there something unique about rice-based cultures that's different than, say, wheat-based cultures? Because it's really rice or wheat are the two fundamental staples for agrarian societies. You know, once human beings started to be settled in places, you had to have staple goods. So you have rice, you have wheat, you have potatoes and root vegetables, and you have something that's got to be very staple to provide nourishment where you live. You know, there's a couple things related to rice that are essential, right? And one is that, you know, rice requires community. It requires farmers, the producers of rice, to be acting, as we say, in concert or in collaboration with one another. So it's based on irrigation and water, and so everybody has to come together and cooperate when producing rice. So all of the local farmers, you know, I think about, I spent a lot of time in the Andes region, and mostly in Ecuador. And I think, I remember always kind of looking at the farmers, and they all operated independently. I mean, they watched the rain, they waited for the rains to come before they would plant, and they, you know, they in some ways helped each other out in lots of ways, and sometimes they would have these kind of cooperative gatherings called mingas, and mingas were like these community work brigades. And but mostly that wasn't the case. Mostly all of the farmers operated independently, but that's not true with rice. You have to plant and irrigate in cooperation with all of the people around you. And so when we think about race-based cultures, we're naturally going to think about the sociology of rice production regarding the larger collectivity and the larger group. So, you know, it's not chance, I don't think, that in rice-based cultures we see unique kinds of governments. We see strong governments, and we see governments. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but I have to hypothesize that some of the legal-based governing systems, that Confucian system here in East Asia, is also rooted or necessary or part of this rice-based culture where you're getting people to cooperate with one another. So, you know, there's a culture piece that is that, you know, I talk about this often, the difference between a communitarian-oriented moral order and an individualist-oriented moral order. And when we talk about moral order, what we're talking about is the way we think about right and wrong and good and bad in a society. And so in Asia, the Confucian-based moral order is much more communitarian than it is in the West. Now, that's not inherently a good thing or a bad thing, but it is different. And what a communitarian-oriented moral order does, it means that the inflection of people is toward other people around them. So everything we do, we're thinking about the impact that it has on everyone around us. And it's not conscious necessarily that that's what's going on, but it is what's happening. And the self, or the needs of the self, or those individual needs become less important as we move along in life. So a satisfying life to me isn't necessarily the one in which I get to do all of the things that I want to do as an individual. A satisfying life to me in a communitarian-oriented moral order is just as likely to be the life that to be satisfying when I see people around me as realizing their own needs as well as my own. So everybody sacrifices a little bit in a certain sense, but it's not seen as a sacrifice. When you have a natural communitarian orientation, as we see in East Asia, emerging out of Confucian thought, well, it's linked to the kinds of the way we dress, the way we educate ourselves, the kinds of food that we eat, all of these types of things. And so it's not chance that we see this kind of rice culture emerge in the places. I mean, we see it emerge. So, kimchi is a food that really doesn't require a lot of people to participate. Unlike rice farming or other types of farming, right? But kimchi is not one of those. Because individuals can make kimchi, I mean, if you want to make a great deal of kimchi, a great amount of kimchi to last throughout the whole winter, well, then you want to have many people participate. But you don't need entire communities to participate. But nonetheless, what we see is this kind of foods like kimchi emerging out of holistic type of culture, because when people make kimchi, there became like a custom in making kimchi. And we see this in many cultures around the world with different foods. Yeah. In my own community, during the harvest season, people would get together and they harvest together. I mean, we see this, different people come and they help each other out with the harvest. Now, the benefit of that is that if in any one year somebody has a difficult time with the harvest, maybe somebody is sick or ill or something like this, or their animals die at the moment that they need to use those animals to harvest, well, you can rely on your neighbors to come and help you out. And so if this happens year after year, that people are participating together in the harvest, well, that means that at any one time, someone is going to need other people to help them. That ensures stability and the greater likelihood of that people will survive to the future, right? In a very strong individualist-oriented culture, well, everyone is on their own. And so if something happens to someone, then you're stuck, and you are harmed. So kimchi is one of these foods that emerged around kind of a collective harvest, that people come together in large groups of people and they make kimchi and they make large amounts of kimchi and they share it. So you're sharing your labor, you're sharing recipes, you're sharing the foods that you made, that you grew from which you were going to make kimchi, right? As you're making kimchi, you're sharing stories, you're sharing the sense that these people around me are important for my survival and I am important for their survival. And so this is where kimchi kind of comes into play. We have people who live near me where I live now, and they follow it. They're called the Amish, and they follow a tradition which they don't use electricity and they don't drive cars. And they really rely on one another for their survival, for production and for consumption. And there's these very tight-knit communities because they're not connected to the larger world. And I think, for them, kimchi is a perfect kind of food, to produce and make kimchi, because everything they do is done as a collective unit. I think about it as a sociologist as just kind of Kim Jong culture, right? Here's the thing. We had this idea that life was very harmonious and everybody got along and everybody gets along, that kind of thing. But when I think about right now Korean politicians, and I think about how they're arguing with one another and they're always at each other's throat and, attacking one another and so on. And I think that, well, that's not just politicians. Life is difficult and people disagree. Disagreement is part of the human experience. Conflict. So harmony requires conflict. This is something that my wife has taught me and talks about all the time. Conflict is part of the human condition. And you don't have harmony without conflict, because conflict is differences. So people come together in a group and they have different ways of seeing the world, different ways of understanding things, different ways of making kimchi. And so when they bring those into the group, there's always going to be some small amount of conflict, right? But it's a small amount of conflict, right? And the conflicts usually generally get worked out pretty quickly. It's when it turns into combat and war that it's a problem, but conflict itself is not a problem. This is all my wife's thinking. This is her theoretical work, her life work, really. So she's really taught me this, and it's very important. I think about 5,000 years of social lives here in Korea. And I think, those 5,000 years are marked by a lot of conflict. And so you need ways to mitigate, we say in English, mitigate or smooth over that conflict. Well, what a better way to do that than to cook together, right? To prepare food. Because making food together is a thing all over the world. Peace groups use cooking and sharing food as a way to promote peace between enemies. So now I think, at least once a year, you're coming together with this really important staple product called kimchi that is essential and it's big, and all Koreans recognize this and have recognized it for centuries and centuries, right? And I think, well, here it is that people are sharing recipes, they're making it together, they're testing out each other's recipes, and they're recognizing and enforcing the idea that I need you and you need me and we all need each other. And so because maybe my crop fails one year and the crops around me don't fail, and so therefore I need you or I won't survive, but maybe in 3 or 4 years my crop will do well and somebody else's crop will fail, right? So I think about harmony. And I think about kimchi, and I think of both making kimchi, right, and sharing kimchi. I think what a perfect way to bring conflict to the surface before it turns into combat, examining the conflict, working with the conflict, and then promoting peace and harmony among the people in various communities and extended families. This kimchi right here has so much power to build community when that community is threatened by factors and forces outside of people's control. And it's threatened by conflict. It emerges for a wide range of reasons. People sometimes ask me, okay, what's your favorite kimchi? And I think, sometimes Koreans ask me that, and they know that, well, there are hundreds of ways to make kimchi, But a lot of times people who are not Korean, who haven't tried a lot of kimchi, they ask me that and they say, oh my gosh, I can't give you an answer. First off, I haven't memorized the names of all the many, many dozens of types of kimchi that I've tried. And I think I'm particularly prone to water kimchi, but I think, well, but water kimchi, water kimchi, as the Koreans say, so many different ways with so many different ingredients. So even that, I don't, but the levels of creativity are so fascinating with kimchi.